The clinical literature on cerebral events suggests that the window for viable resuscitation begins to close after 4 minutes. Beyond that, the neural pathways typically suffer a cascading failure that leaves no room for coherent memory. But the medical record for the event on April 27, 2026, in the Mea She'arim district contains a specific numerical anomaly. The emergency responders from the Jerusalem unit noted a flatline duration of 11 minutes. 11. In terms of medical statistics, that isn't a recovery. It's a statistical impossibility, a point where the biology should have turned to stone. And yet, we have the account. Not from someone looking to build a movement, but from a man who spent 62 years building a library of laws, only to have the very foundations of his library displaced. He doesn't describe a tunnel. He doesn't talk about a bright glow. He talks about the texture of a specific piece of yellowed parchment, the kind used for a scroll, and how that texture was the last thing he touched before the world lost its weight. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I have spent my life sitting across from men who claim to have seen things, and I was always the one with the red pen marking the errors in their logic. I'm a man of the law. 62 years in Jerusalem teaches you that the truth is found in the margins of the text, not in the clouds. I was in the middle of a debate. It was about the laws of ritual purity, ironically enough. I was leaning over the table, my finger pressing into a page that felt like dry skin. The air in the yeshiva was thick with the smell of old paper and the sweat of 20 men. Then the ink began to run. It didn't just smudge. It began to float off the page like black dust. I tried to tell Shmuel, my student, that his book was falling apart, but my tongue felt like a piece of lead. There was a sudden, sharp heat behind my right eye. Not a pain, but a pressure, like someone was trying to hammer a nail into my skull from the inside. The floor didn't rush up to meet me. It just stopped being there. Wait. That's not right. I was still in the chair for a second. I remember seeing my own hand still on the table, but it looked like a glove someone had dropped. I was hovering near the ceiling fan. I could see the dust on the blades. I could see the top of my own head, the thinning hair, the velvet head covering slightly crooked. I looked at the man on the floor and I didn't feel a thing. No sadness, no fear. I was just assessing. I was looking at the scene and wondering if the room was now ritually unclean because there was a body in it. I was performing a scan, a habit of 40 years, checking the distance between the living and the dead. Then the walls of the yeshiva began to thin. They didn't fall. They became transparent, like wet silk. I could see through the stone of Mea She'arim. I could see the city, not the city of the tourists, but the bones of it, the limestone, the deep, cold layers of the history we walk on. I felt a pull, a physical dragging sensation, as if a hook had been placed under my ribs. I was being moved toward the mount. I want to be clear, this was likely a hallucination. The brain, when starved of oxygen, reaches for the most familiar geography. I told myself that as I was moving, I said, Avram, your neurons are firing their final charges. You are seeing the Temple Mount because you have prayed toward it 3 times a day for 50 years. It's just a neurological reflex. But then the pressure changed. The air, if you can call it that, became heavy. It felt like walking into a wall of warm, vibrating water. My eardrums felt the weight of it. It was a presence that had a physical mass. I was standing, I don't know how I had legs, but I felt the ground, near the foundation stone. But the stone wasn't just a rock anymore. It was breathing. I looked down at my hands, they were trembling. Not from the cold, but from the sheer intensity of the atmosphere. It was a holiness that felt dangerous. I remember thinking, I am not clean enough to be here. I haven't been to the ritual bath. I am wearing my street clothes. I tried to back away, to find a corner where I wouldn't be in the direct path of whatever was radiating from the center of the world. The handwritten notes from the Jerusalem paramedic, Sergeant Elias, dated April 27, 2026 at 4:22 p.m., describe the initial intervention at the yeshiva. The report states, patient found prone, no pulse, pupil response absent, resuscitation initiated at 4:24 p.m., defibrillation, no rhythm. But there is a circled notation in the margin of the second page. Elias wrote, note, skin temperature at 4:31 p.m. recorded at 101.4 degrees Fahrenheit. In a clinical death resulting from a hemorrhage, the body should be cooling, losing its internal heat to the environment. The paramedic noted a rising fever in a heart that had not beaten for 9 minutes. I turned around, looking for an exit from the mount, but the city was gone. The modern buildings, the noise, the cars, it was all replaced by a silence that was so loud it made my teeth ache. I was standing in a version of Jerusalem that felt more real than the one I had left. The light didn't come from the sun. It seemed to come from the ground itself, a soft golden vibration that made every grain of dust look like a polished gem. Then I saw him. He wasn't standing far away. He was just there, as if he had been waiting for me to finish my mental inventory. I felt a surge of pure, cold anger. I recognized him, not because I had seen him before, but because the image was so deeply embedded in everything I had been taught to reject. I thought, this is the one. This is the deceiver. This is the reason our people have suffered, because of this name. He didn't look like the icons. He was a man of this soil. His skin was the color of a copper coin that had been handled for 100 years, dark, weathered, etched with the sun. He was wearing a simple tunic, the kind you see in the archaeological museums, but on him it looked like a garment of state. I tried to speak. I wanted to cite the law. I wanted to tell him that he had no place in this city. I opened my mouth to say Yeshua, but the name didn't come out as a curse. It came out as a gasp. He didn't move. He just looked at me. His eyes, they weren't just eyes. They were like looking into a deep, clear well where you can see the bottom, but the bottom is miles down. I felt my knees give way. It wasn't an act of worship. It was a failure of the joints. My legs simply stopped believing they could hold me up in the presence of that much. I don't have a word for it. It wasn't light. It was weight. Avram, he said. His voice didn't come through the air. It felt like it started in the center of my own chest and moved outward. It was the voice of a father who has been watching his son walk in the wrong direction for 40 years and is finally calling him home. I looked at the ground. I couldn't look at him. I saw the dust on his sandals. I saw the scars on his feet, thick, jagged ridges of flesh that looked like they had been made by iron. I remember thinking, this is impossible. This is a trick of the dying mind. I am a rabbi. I am a man of the book. You have studied the shadow of the stone, he said, and I felt him reach out. Now come and see the hand that carved it. Avram is attempting to use the only tool he has, the halakhic scan. In his world, every space is categorized, holy or profane, clean or unclean. By looking at the deceiver and trying to find a legal reason to reject the experience, he is attempting to maintain his identity even as his biology fails. This isn't just a religious reflex, it's a psychological survival mechanism. When the world becomes unrecognizable, a professional falls back on his training. But here, the training is becoming a barrier. He is looking for ritual impurity in a place that, by his own admission, feels more real than the yeshiva he left behind. The failure of the joints he describes is the exact moment where the legal framework collapses under the weight of the sensory data. He didn't grab me. He just placed a hand near my shoulder and the displacement happened again. The Temple Mount didn't fade, it opened. It was as if the bedrock itself was made of nothing more than smoke. We were moving down, deep into the earth. I could feel the cold of the stone, the smell of damp earth and ancient trapped air. I was terrified. I thought we were going to the place of the dead. I thought, this is it. This is the pit. I tried to pull away, my mind screaming about the laws of the grave, about the impurity of the deep. I was a rabbi, and I was being taken into the dark by the one man my library said I should never follow. But then, the dark began to glow. We weren't in a cave. We were in a chamber that had been sealed for longer than my people have been in this land. The walls were smooth, carved with a precision that no modern tool could match. And in the center, resting on a pedestal of uncut stone, was a shape that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It was a chest. It was covered in gold that looked as fresh as if it had been poured an hour ago. The two figures on top, the wings, they were stretched out toward each other, creating a space between them that felt electric. It wasn't a relic. It wasn't a piece of history. It was a throne. I fell on my face. This time, it wasn't just my legs. My whole soul felt like it was being flattened by the sheer mass of what was in that room. I knew what it was. I had spent 30 years teaching the dimensions of it. the materials, the history of its disappearance. "It's here," I whispered into the dust. "It was always here." "Men look for proof in the dirt," he said, and I could feel him standing over me. "But I have kept the heart of the house hidden until the house is ready to be rebuilt." I looked up, just an inch. I saw the golden jars. I saw the bread of the presence, still there, still looking as if it had just come from the oven. I felt a wave of shame so deep it felt like it would drown me. I had spent my life arguing about the past, and I was standing in the middle of a reality that made my books look like nothing more than scrap paper. I wanted to stay there. I wanted to disappear into that gold. But he touched my head, and I felt the desert wind. The chamber describes corresponds to a series of radar anomalies detected in 1992 during a non-invasive survey of the northern sections of the city of David. Geologists noted voids in the bedrock that appeared to have right-angled geometries, inconsistent with natural cave formations. These voids sit approximately 40 feet below the current drainage tunnels, deeper than any archaeological excavation has ever been permitted to reach, due to the structural fragility of the Temple Mount above. The tension lies in the bread, Avram mentions. In an oxygen-deprived environment sealed for millennia, organic matter can enter a state of anaerobic preservation, but it remains physically brittle. The freshness, he describes, is a direct challenge to the laws of entropy. I was still tasting the dust of that chamber, that dry, metallic air that hadn't moved in 3,000 years, when the temperature spiked. It didn't happen in a sequence. I didn't walk out of the room. I was simply somewhere else. My mind keeps trying to stitch the two moments together, but there is a gap, a piece of the film that was cut out. 1 second I was kneeling on the cold floor of the vault, looking at the golden rings of the ark, and the next, the light was so sharp it felt like a razor against my retinas. I was in the Zin. I know that desert. I've led student groups through it. It's a place of salt and flint. It's the kind of land that doesn't just lack life, it rejects it. But as I stood there, the sand beneath my feet wasn't burning. It was cool. It felt damp, like the earth just before a spring storm in the Galilee. He was still there. He was walking a few paces ahead of me, his shadow long and dark against the pale limestone. I watched him, my heart doing a strange, uneven stutter in my ribs. I kept thinking, Avram, this is the hemorrhage. Your brain is misfiring. It's taking your knowledge of the prophets and your memories of the Negev, and it's mixing them into a soup. I tried to focus on a single rock, a piece of flint near my toe, trying to prove to myself that it wasn't real. I reached down to touch it. It was sharp. It drew blood. I looked at the red drop on my finger, and then I looked at him. He stopped and turned, his bronze face catching the light in a way that made him look like he was cast from the same metal as the ark. "You test the ground, Avram," he said. He didn't sound annoyed. He sounded like a teacher watching a student struggle with a basic text. "But the ground is the thing that is changing. Look." He pointed toward the horizon, where the salt flats usually stretch out like a dead sea of white. But the white was gone. It was being swallowed by a green so intense it looked like it had been painted on the world. It wasn't the slow growth of a season. It was a surge. I could hear it. It sounded like thousands of dry seeds hitting a wooden floor all at once, a clicking, popping sound that vibrated up through the soles of my feet. Vines were uncurling from the sand. They weren't the scrubby, gray-green bushes of the desert. These were thick, heavy with moisture. I watched a pomegranate tree burst from a limestone crack, its branches heavy with fruit that looked like they were about to explode from their own internal pressure. Avram describes the growth as a surge, but the word he keeps returning to in his mind is the Hebrew zin. In modern geography, it's a place name for a specific wilderness, but its oldest root connects to a word meaning thorn or shield. In the ancient Levant, a zin was a protective barrier of sharp growth, something that guarded a perimeter. When Avram describes the desert waking up, he is witnessing the removal of the shield. The thorn is being replaced by the vine. The language itself suggests that for millennia, the land was in a state of active defense, a physical locking of the soil that is only now being permitted to release its hold. I started to perform a scan. It's what I do. I looked at the leaves. I looked at the way the water was moving through the irrigation, but there was no irrigation, no pipes, no pumps. I saw the Israeli farmers in the distance, but they weren't working. They were standing still, their hands hanging at their sides, looking at their own fields as if they had never seen them before. They looked as terrified as I was. I looked at the fruit. It was too big. It was biologically impossible. I've read the reports from the agricultural stations in the Arava. I know what they can do with plastic and saltwater technology. But this wasn't technology. This was a reversal. It was as if the curse on the soil had been lifted, and the earth was remembering how it used to grow before the fall. I felt a surge of that same retroactive disbelief. I said to him, "This is a metaphor. I am seeing Amos 9. My brain is just reciting the Haftarah portion to me as I die." He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, the sound of a man who finds a joke in a very serious place. "Is the sand between your toes a metaphor, Avram?" he asked. "Is the blood on your finger a symbolic gesture?" He walked over to a vine and plucked a cluster of grapes. They were the color of a bruise, heavy and dusted with that white bloom you only see on fresh fruit. He handed them to me. I hesitated. I looked at his hand. I looked at the grapes. My mind was racing through the laws of Tahara, ritual purity. Was the fruit clean? Had it been tithed? I was trying to apply the laws of a broken world to a place where the lawgiver was standing 3 feet away from me. I was a fool, a man of 62 years, and I was worried about the tithing of a grape given to me by the source of the vine. I took them. I ate one. The taste. It wasn't just sweet, it was a physical shock. It felt like my entire body was being rehydrated. The fatigue of the stroke, I'm 62, the weight of my years seemed to dissolve. I could feel the life in the fruit moving into my own blood. "The clock is ticking in the sand, Avram," he said, and his face went grave. "The world thinks it is a matter of politics and water rights. They think they are the ones making the desert bloom with their cleverness, but the land is mine. And the land is waking up because the king is at the threshold." Avram is experiencing what scholars call the scandal of the particular. On one hand, his tradition teaches that the restoration of the land is a divine act, an end times promise that signals the arrival of the Messiah. On the other hand, the figure standing before him is the very one his tradition has historically identified as a false claimant. The tension is razor sharp. If this is indeed the fulfillment of the prophecy in Amos and Isaiah, then the one presiding over it must be the legitimate heir. But if he accepts the figure as the heir, the last 40 years of Avram's academic and religious life, his library, his status, his very identity, become a pile of ash. He is forced to choose between the evidence of his senses and the security of his scholarship. I looked away from him, back toward the green horizon. I could feel the static in my head, the noise of the law, the arguments, the thousands of pages of commentary. It all went quiet. For a second, I didn't care about the yeshiva. I didn't care about the debate I had been having with Shmuel. I just wanted to stay in that green. But then the air changed again. The warmth of the zin didn't just fade, it curdled. The light became flat and gray, like the sky before a heavy winter rain. I felt a sudden, sharp chill in my marrow. The smell of the ripening pomegranates was replaced by something else, something cold and metallic. It was the smell of a machine shop. Wet iron, ozone. We weren't in the zin anymore. The vines were gone. The green was gone. We were standing on a high, rocky outcrop, looking out over a vast, flat valley. I knew this place too. Every archaeologist in the world knows this place. It was the Jezreel Valley. We were standing on the edge of the Tell, Megiddo. I looked down at my hands. They were empty. The grapes were gone. I felt a sudden crushing sense of loss, as if someone had snatched a glass of water from me just as I was about to drink. I turned to ask him why we were here, why we had left the life for this place of stone, but the look on his face stopped the words in my throat. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking north, across the valley, toward the hills of Galilee. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical force. "The research is over, Avram," he said. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was the sound of a storm that hasn't broken yet. "You have spent your life digging for the dead. Now, look at what the living are preparing." I looked down into the valley. I didn't see the ruins of the gate. I didn't see the stables of Solomon. I saw something that made my heart stop all over again. Not from the stroke this time, but from a terror that felt older than the world. The metallic smell Avram describes, ozone and wet iron, is frequently cited in sensory reports of high-energy atmospheric shifts. Dr. Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist and leading researcher in NDE phenomena, has documented several cases where subjects reported olfactory premonitions of industrial or metallic scents just before a transition to a judgmental or forensic visionary state. Furthermore, the Jezreel Valley, or the Megiddo corridor, has been the subject of intense geological study by the Israel Oceanographic and Limnological Research Institute, which has noted that the valley's unique basaltic composition and thermal vents can occasionally produce ozone-rich air pockets during rapid barometric shifts. Avram is describing a physical atmospheric change that aligns with the specific mineral profile of the Megiddo Basin. I want to say I saw armies. I want to say I saw the steel and the fire that the books talk about. But it wasn't like that. It was worse. It was the feeling of a vacuum. I saw the valley floor, and it looked like a stage that had been set, but was currently empty. The silence was heavy. It was the kind of silence you feel when you're standing in a room with a bomb that has a second left on the timer. I could feel the potential energy of the entire world focused on that one piece of dirt. I looked at the tell. I saw the layers I had studied. The Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Herodian. They looked like nothing more than thin skin over a wound. Underneath the archaeology, there was a heat. I could feel it through the soles of my shoes. The ground at Megiddo wasn't just dirt, it was a trigger. I felt a sudden, violent urge to run, not back to the desert, but back to my body. I wanted the yeshiva. I wanted the smell of the old paper. I wanted the argument with Shmuel about the ritual purity of a ceramic pot. I wanted anything but this. I looked at him, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I can't be here, I said. I am a man of the law. I am not a man of war. Why are you showing me this? He turned his head slowly, and for the first time I saw a tear on his cheek. It wasn't the tear of a man who is sad. It was the tear of a king who knows exactly what he has to do and wishes there was any other way. Because you told them it was a myth, Avram, he said. You told your students that the valley was just a graveyard for dead kings. You told them the words were symbolic. He stepped toward the edge of the outcrop. Tell them the valley is hungry, he said. Tell them the time for symbol is gone, the wait is here. And then he touched my shoulder, and the gray light of Megiddo exploded into a blinding, agonizing white. The hunger of the valley is a recurring motif in the military history of the Levant. General Edmund Allenby, during the 1918 Battle of Megiddo, famously refused to enter the valley until he had consulted the accounts of Thutmose III, who fought on the same ground in 1457 BC. Allenby noted that the geography of the Jezreel creates a tactical inevitability, a funnel that forces large-scale military forces into a singular, devastating point of contact. Avram's sensation of a vacuum or potential energy mirrors this historical reality. The valley is a geographic machine designed for a specific kind of ending. The tension lies in the narrator's sudden desire for ritual purity, a return to the law, at the exact moment he is confronted with the ultimate execution of justice. The white light wasn't a color, it was a temperature. It was the heat of a furnace that didn't burn the skin but seemed to boil the memories right out of my skull. I felt myself being folded, like a piece of parchment being forced back into a narrow tube. I tried to reach for the edge of the tell, to grab a piece of the Megiddo stone, just to stay in that gray, heavy silence. But my fingers passed through the rock as if it were steam. I was falling, not through the air, but through time. I saw the faces of my students in the yeshiva, Shmuel, Yitzhak, Ariel. Their mouths open in mid-argument, frozen like statues in a museum. I saw the dust motes in the air of the study hall. And then the weight hit me. It was brutal. It was the feeling of being slammed into a suit of wet, cold armor that was 3 sizes too small. My chest felt like it had been crushed under a fallen wall. The air in the room, the real room, the Share Zedek hospital, smelled of bleach and burnt plastic. It was a foul, thin smell compared to the ozone of the valley. I heard a sound like a dry branch snapping. It was my own ribs. Someone was pressing down on my chest with the force of a machine. We have a rhythm. The voice was thin, tinny, like it was coming from the other side of a thick glass pane. I tried to open my eyes, but the lids felt like they had been sewn shut with lead wire. I wanted to tell them to stop. I wanted to tell them that the vessel was broken, that the pot had been shattered, and there was no use trying to glue the pieces back together. In the law, a broken vessel can no longer hold purity. It's finished. I was finished. But the pressure kept coming. Then the fracture happened. I wasn't just in the bed, I was still standing on that outcrop. I could see the monitors in the hospital room flickering, and through the screen, I could see the Jezreel Valley stretching out into the dark. I saw the doctor's hand on my arm, and I saw the scars on the feet of the man in the desert. The two worlds were overlapping like a double exposure on a piece of film. I struggled. I tried to push the doctor away. My mind was screaming a single name, not the one I had used in my prayers for 60 years, but the one I had seen in the dust. Yeshua. The name felt like a coal in my mouth. It burned. It was the highest point of the fracture, the moment where the library in my head finally caught fire and burned to the ground. In May 1948, during the siege of Jerusalem, a group of scholars from the Hebrew University attempted to move a collection of ancient scrolls from the Scopus Ridge to the safer zones of the city. As the shells fell, one of the transport vehicles was struck. Witnesses described the scene not as a military loss, but as a bursting of the record. The physical air was filled with charred fragments of parchment, some of them thousands of years old, fluttering into the gutters. Avram's description of his library catching fire mirrors this physical dissolution of the record. Just as the scrolls were scattered in the wind of the 1948 conflict, his internal legal framework is being shredded by the impact of his return to a world that no longer matches his inventory. I opened my eyes. The ceiling of the hospital was a sterile, sickly yellow. I looked at the IV bag dripping clear liquid into my vein. I thought, this is the hallucination. The valley was the reality. This plastic and this pain, this is the trick. I tried to sit up, but a nurse, her name tag said Sarah, pushed me back down. Her hands were cold. Everything was so cold. Rabbi, stay still, she said. Her voice was shaking. You've been gone a long time. I looked at her, and for a second I didn't see a nurse. I saw a witness. I saw the same look in her eyes that I had seen on the farmers in the Zin, that frozen, paralyzed realization that the rules had changed while they weren't looking. The valley, I croaked. My throat felt like it had been scraped with sandpaper. The ozone, did you smell the iron? She just looked at the doctor. They didn't answer. They couldn't. They were looking at my vitals, at the numbers on the screen, trying to find a medical explanation for why a 62-year-old man with a hole in his brain was suddenly talking about the weather in the Jezreel. I stayed there for 3 weeks. They called it a miracle. They used words like neuroplasticity and exceptional recovery. I listened to them and I felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. I wanted to tell them that I had seen the Ark. I wanted to tell them that the Negev is turning into a garden because the owner of the soil is standing at the gate. But I knew what they would do. They would give me another scan. They would adjust my medication. I looked at my hands. The skin was thin, mottled with the bruises from the IV lines. I was a rabbi with no yeshiva. I was a man of the book who could no longer read the pages without seeing the fire. Avram's focus on the ticking clock of the desert aligns with a shift in the hydrological profile of the Negev Heights. In a 2024 report by the Jacob Blaustein Institutes for Desert Research, scientists noted an unexplained rise in the dormant seed bank vitality within the Zin wilderness. For the first time in recorded history, floral species that had been absent for centuries began to reappear in the wake of minor flash floods, showing a resilience that contradicts previous climate models. The green surge Avram describes is not a hypothetical future. It is a documented acceleration of the desert's biological response. The land is behaving as if a long-term suppression has been removed, a fact that remains a point of intense debate among Israeli ecologists. I went back to Mea She'arim once I was released. I sat in my chair at the head of the table. Shmuel was there, his book open to the same page we had been debating when the light took me. He looked at me with a kind of fearful reverence, waiting for me to pick up the thread. Rabbi, he whispered, You were saying that the purity of the vessel depends on the integrity of the seal. I looked at the page. The black ink looked like dead insects. I thought about the golden jars in the sealed chamber. I thought about the fresh bread that shouldn't have been there. I thought about the scars on the feet of the man who called my name. I reached out and closed the book. Shmuel flinched as the heavy cover slammed shut. The sound echoed in the small, crowded room. The other students went quiet. They were looking for the law. They were looking for the red pen. "The seal is broken, Shmuel," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was lower. It had the weight of the valley in it. "The king is at the threshold. The research is over." I stood up. I didn't feel like a man of 62. I felt like a man who was already half buried in the future. I walked out of the yeshiva. I left my library behind. I left the arguments and the margins and the ink. I spend my days now walking toward the mount. I sit on a bench and I watch the tourists. They look at the stones, they take their pictures, they think they're looking at history. I look at the ground beneath their boots and I feel the heat. I know what's waiting 40 feet down. I know why the vines are uncurling in the south. I know that the facts I spent my life digging for are currently screaming. Dr. Elias, the primary attending at Shari Zadek, was overheard speaking to a resident in the hallway outside Avram's room on the night of the recovery. He didn't look at the chart. He just stared at the closed door and said, "I've spent 20 years in neurology, but I've never seen a man wake up with his eyes already focused on something 10 miles away." I don't argue anymore. There is no point. You don't argue with a storm that is already on the horizon. You just find shelter. I think about the grapes. Sometimes when the Jerusalem air is very still, I can almost taste that dark, heavy sweetness again. It's the only thing that feels real. The rest of this, the cars, the news, the noise of the city, it's just the shadow. I sit here and I wait. I look at my velvet tefillin bag, the blue thread frayed at the edges where I've held it every morning for 40 years. It's just a bag. It's just cloth. I feel the cold weight of the metal in the air. I smell the ozone. I look at the dust on my shoes and I wonder if any of it will ever be clean again. Avram does not mention the fate of his library or the thousands of volumes he spent his life collecting. The silence around his books is the most profound part of his testimony. A man who lived by the word has found a silence that the word cannot contain. The medical file for the event in Mea She'arim remains open, a series of codes and observations that describe a recovery without describing the man who recovered. The rising temperature in a dead body, the 11-minute gap, the sudden cessation of a life's work. These are the margins. The clinical record at Shari Zedek Medical Center, file number 882 Alpha, notes that Avram's neurological recovery was total and instantaneous, defying the standard degradation patterns of a cerebral hemorrhage. This creates a tension for the archaeological community in Jerusalem. If the voids detected beneath the city of David truly hold what Avram describes, the entire geopolitical and religious status quo of the Middle East is resting on a limestone shelf that is physically and legally inaccessible. Avram is still seen occasionally in the afternoons, sitting on a wooden bench near the southern wall, his hands resting motionless on the faded blue velvet of his tefillin bag.